Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 38th chapter in the book of Job. This marks the beginning of the dramatic and thrilling climax of the book of Job. In the previous 36 chapters, 35 chapters, we've heard human monologues, but then divinity finally speaks. And so it's only fitting and appropriate that he get the final word. Now, if this portion was absent in the book of Job, it would be an unsatisfactory conclusion. So this completes the picture beginning in here. And the discourses of him are two discourses, the first of which spans the range of the 38th and the 39th chapter, after which time Job does not deign to offer a counter rebuttal. He just acknowledges his own ignorance and repents in the dust and the ashes. And he does that after his second discourse, chapters 40 through 41. And then the 42nd chapter, the final chapter, resumes the narrative format. But what does he say now? His first discourse can be broken down into two parts. The 38th chapter is first off, Job receives the long petitioned, his request, his most heartfelt prayer is finally answered. As early as the 13th chapter, he prays for an audience with the Almighty, and as late as the 31st, that's the final time we've heard from him. But, he's addressing Job and all these people, but Job is ultimately the only one who speaks to him. And the way that the first discourse is Job demands an audience for his vindication and for an explanation. He only gets the first. He does not get the second. But he does not owe us. He is a God of not of explanations, but of promises. So he does promise Job all these things, twofold of his wealth and the same number of children that he once has. But he doesn't owe us an explanation, and he rests his claim to be beyond any explanation for anything in his moral universe. He just exalts his own grandeur through creation, and in the 38th chapter, Job's inability to explain his created order disqualifies him from questioning his moral order. So he does argue from the vantage point of might and right, and within the chapter we're going to cover today, there are two items in the creation account. The cosmic, this is the first 21 verses. We're going to try and make it at least that far. And then the meteorological. So in the one we're going to every day, we're going to read of earth and sea and sun and the netherworld and light and darkness. But before that, Elihu is now Job's. The last time we heard from him, as we previously mentioned, was the 31st chapter. In between then and here, we hear from Elihu, who speaks in the final in the fourth and final of his discourses, the second chapter of it, the 37th chapter, the sixth chapter that we hear from him. He speaks of the experience of being visited by the voice of the Almighty, just likening it to thunder, which is consistent with the 29th Psalm, and they're about to hear what he speaks of. But we broke this chapter down into two parts. We're going to cover verse 14 through 24, beginning with verse 14. Listen to this, O Job, stand still and consider the wonders of El. Do you know when Eloah placed them or caused the lightnings of his cloud to shine? 15th verse anticipates what Yahweh's argument. He argues from the vantage point of might is right. He argues from the superiority of his strength. So for him to be omnipotent but not just, he would cease to be God. We'll hold that thought, more on that later. But this is, he argues from if you cannot explain any of the things, why the universe is in motion, when it all happened, were you there? The angels were there. I didn't see you there. So who are you to question anything in my order at all? Do you know the balancing of the clouds, the wonders of the one perfect in knowledge? That he's speaking of an omniscient being, and he is incomprehensible inasmuch as he is omniscient. Human finite cognitive faculties can only scratch the surface of all that there is to know of God, but the danger is when we allow our lack of knowledge to supersede our trust in him. But just the ability to balance the clouds, to scatter them strategically across the earth, to give their lightnings and their rains respectively as cursings and blessings, or sometimes just indiscriminately, he makes his rain to shine on the just and unjust alike, but that is all part of his sovereign providence. Teach us what we should say to him. We do not put in order because of darkness. This is the 19th verse, and as early as the 9th verse, Job confesses that he would be dumbfounded, he would be tongue-tied to speak before the Almighty, should he deign to condescend to Job. But by the 13th chapter, he prays for this audience, and as he progressively gets more presumptuous, so much so that by the tail end of the 31st chapter, we read him that he would approach the Almighty like a prince. But then he says that he would know exactly what to say, but he is tongue-tied. So Elihu, there is nothing that we can teach him. There is nothing we can say. Verse 20, should he be told that I would speak, would any man ask to be swallowed up? So there is nothing we can say to him or teach him, and when he asks us a question, it is always and only to test us. He does not lack any item of information, because as an omniscient being, that means he knows every item of information, past, present, and future, all at once, comprehensively and panoramically. Verse 23, the Almighty, we have not found him out. He is exalted in power and justice and great in righteousness. He does not oppress. He is an incomprehensible mystery wrapped in an enigma and just a puzzle of paradox all the way down. So to claim to be able to define the one who a definition by definition rarely exceeds one sentence, and we cannot accurately encapsulate all that God is in a single sentence, and it is folly to even try. But his power is exalted, and this just speaks of his aboveness and transcendence. And just, he is, of course, even though oppression does exist on the earth, he himself does not oppress. Therefore, men revere him. He does not regard any who are wise in heart. Opening criticism that we read from the mouth of Yahweh to Job is, who is this who speaks words of ignorance? So Job thought he was wise, but he was just exposing his ignorance. So Yahweh, the Almighty, was in fact listening to this dialogue between these human counterparts the whole time, and he chimes in and he gets the last word, inappropriately so. 38th chapter, verse 1. Then Yahweh answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Yahweh, this is the covenant name of Israel. So Job and his friends none of them were Israelites. They were not Hebrew, so they always refer to him as El Shaddai. But the author of Job, who would have been Hebrew, would have used the covenantal name Yahweh. The only time we hear that is in 12:9. I think it's from the mouth of Job. But otherwise he is elsewhere only referred to as such by the author of Job, distinct from the characters, who the nomenclature of preference is El Shaddai, God Almighty. But he's answering Job specifically and out of the whirlwind. Now the whirlwind is a frequent manifestation, a theophanic manifestation. In Sinai, he came in a storm. He translated Elijah from heaven to death, from life to heaven through a whirlwind in the 2nd chapter of 2 Kings. And even before that, he visited him in a storm-like substance in the 19th chapter of the 1st book of Kings. Ezekiel, when he was on the river Shebar, his prophetic calling came in a whirlwind, and there's just all these cherubims and all these things there. We can read of that in the 1st chapter. And Nahum also describes his vision like a whirlwind. So a whirlwind is something of physical intensity. This is just a display of his grandeur and his might. So he is an invisible entity, but he speaks through this whirlwind. That is how he reveals himself. So Job doesn't get an explanation, but he does get a revelation. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Words without knowledge, Job was, objectively speaking, a wise human. This book belongs in the category of Old Testament wisdom literature. So there is much wisdom expressed between Job and Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and Elihu, but compared to him, none of us are wise. He is absolutely wise. When we speak of human wisdom, that is a relative term. And Job does eventually admit his guilt. He confesses as much, that he spoke without knowledge in 42:3. So those who speak without knowing what they speak of, that is a mark and measure of a fool. So Job was in searing pain, so he wasn't in his best a bit. But, woe unto them who are wise in their own eyes, Isaiah's 5th chapter and Proverbs 3:7. Now gird up your loins like a man, and I ask you, and you answer me. Job was a man, and God expects men to be men, and he expects to be women. These types of sins which blur the clear distinction between male and female are satanic. But we don't want to get distracted by that. Job is a man, and as such, that is how he's calling him to respond to him. He asked for this as early as the 13th chapter and as late as the 31st. So he's called to stand up and just make himself known. Stand up like a man and answer me. You can, if you have at any time an answer, by all means say it. But I'm going to ask you a flow of rhetorical questions that just expose your own ignorance. And Yahweh was not questioning Job's integrity or sincerity, only his ability to explain the ways of him, the one whose ways are higher than our ways. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Every life form that inhabits this pale blue dot, the earth is obviously logically prior, so the earth had to come before any living being who has ever walked it or flown up or swam on it could even be there. So the angels were there, but no human, no life form was. The earth came before them in the creative design and the of the omniscient architect. But the foundations of the earth, that's just where it all began, and this rings bells. Our predestination was before the foundation of the earth, Ephesians 1-4. I do have I don't struggle with the doctrine of predestination, but I do advise caution in claiming the mandate of the saved for reasons that are not necessarily here or there. But, to understand just how the earth came into being, we can study it scientifically, but we cannot explain its origins. Science itself is incompetent to explain origins, so that's why we have theology to explain. None of us can even comprehend or intuit or imagine the process through which he formed this planet we inhabit. That is beyond our understanding, but not beyond his. But he doesn't explain it all. He just says, I know these things. What do you know? Your wisdom, my wisdom. Who appointed its measurements, if you know, or who stretched the line upon it? God describes himself as the architect of creation. He is the one who designs it. He's also the builder. He's the one who builds the foundation, and this combines his attributes of omnipotence and omnipresence, because the existence of creation implies a creator who was wise enough to conceive a plan, the laws of physics, and bring them about into being. This requires an infinitely or unlimited God who is infinite or unlimited in his strength and power. But, start to finish, he is the architect, and the architecture is really a sign of his omniscience, but the building of it, the actual creation of it, is a sign of his omnipotence. So the dimensions, the indescribable, inapproachable dimensions of the cosmos are what's laid out on the line here. This is going to influence much of what we read of come after that. And upon what were its foundations sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? The cornerstone was, architecturally speaking, the absolutely most vital stone. Without the cornerstone, the whole structure would collapse. So the cornerstone was the most important one, because the Messiah is preeminent and identified as the cornerstone. He declared himself to be the cornerstone in the 118th Psalm, and after several parables of his in the Synoptics. But, the cornerstone, now he's likening the building of an earth a round ball that is exponentially more voluminous than any structure, like a house or a building or even a temple or a palace. But he's using architectural terms because we don't know the intricacies of building an entire earth and setting it in motion in an entire galaxy and universe are so beyond us that we cannot to claim to explain the ways or the minds of God is blasphemous in a sense. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of Elohim shouted for joys. The morning stars are the stars of the sky, and just the bright ones. And the sons of Elohim, these are the angels. They are referenced as such as early as 1:6 and also in 2:1. So the angels were there. They were present at this occasion, this glorious occasion when the foundation of the earth was laid and set in motion. But where were you, Job? Tell me if you were there, if you could claim anything like first-hand direct knowledge as to when it happened, how it happened, and why it happened. By all means, I'm inviting you. You can answer me at any time. But Job adopts the posture of stunned silence and just humbles himself in repentance and confesses his error and repents appropriately in the dust and ashes. But the creation was a joyous occasion, and the entire angels and the stars in the skies would have sang for joy at that occasion, because that is a joy to behold. Everything was good, very good, in the original pristine created order, Genesis 1:31. Or enclosed the sea with doors when it burst out and came forth from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and assigned to it my laws, and put bars and doors, and said, this far you have come, but no further, and here are your proud waves stop. So this is a single sentence that just declares what exactly goes into the containing of the otherwise uncontainable currents of the sea, which are so beyond us physically, but they are all in his hands. The same creator of the cosmos is the one who has control over the sea and the sky and everything in it. So we're going to break this down from the first verse, 8th verse. So the sea with the doors of the sea. Doors are where it cannot get past because it does not have opposable thumbs. But he describes the creation of the sea to a birth process. So there's plenty of life, sea life. There's more abundant life in the sea than anywhere else. So it's appropriate to liken its creation to a birth process. The clouds are its garments. These are the clouds in the sky. So the sky is the clothing in the sense of him who is exalted, the exterior of all the stuff that lays below, and thick darkness that is something beyond our abilities to comprehend or control. Where the darkness comes, he creates the light and the dark, Isaiah 45:7. But the laws of physics, there is no disobedience allowed in the laws of physics, although a miracle is when he intervenes and interrupts the law of his own physics. That's a supernatural power in motion is what a miracle is. But the bounds and the doors, everything in creation cannot go too far, because the sea left to itself without its appropriate boundaries, it would swallow all the continental landmass. So he's the one who sets the dimensions and the boundaries and the barriers between all these elements in the meteorological and cosmological order. We're not going to get into the cosmology quite yet. I mean the meteorology. That's the second half of this chapter. This far you have come, but no farther. The elements in nature are at his command and control. They can move nowhere without his permission, and they are incapable of disobeying. Proud waves stop. Waves do not have human psyches. They cannot be proud, but, they can extend beyond their natural barriers. But he's the one who puts it in its appropriate limitation. Have you ever commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, to take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? The morning, we've all experienced the morning. We know the sun rises, but who put the morning in motion? We are just in a repetitive cycle that began eons before us. So the rising of the sun is nothing new. But who of us can claim to, be the one who rises the sun and sets it at night in its daily cycles? That is implicitly something that belongs in God's jurisdiction. But the wicked, the judgment of the wicked. Now, this is, earlier I mentioned that the book of Job would not be complete without what begins in the 38th chapter. So why does wickedness reign on the earth, and why does injustice and oppression flourish? Where is this loving God? But to criticize God for not intervening is tantamount to criticizing a novelist for not resolving the plot midway through. So this story, human history does have its consummation, and that's when justice will be meted out perfectly, finally, thoroughly, and totally. It is changed like clay under a seal, and they stand out like a garment, and their light is withheld from the wicked, and the arm lifted up it's broken. The wicked, according to John's 3rd chapter, they by their own election eschew the light. They prefer the darkness because sin demands a cloak and a cover, and darkness gives license and pretext for sinners to do what they please. But he deprives his blessings, his light. If his face shines upon you, that is another way of saying that his blessings are pouring on you. And to him, he does not shower blessings on the wicked. Wickedness does pay a price, even though it seems that many in the world are flourishing and they are wicked people. They are still under his command and his control, and they will have to answer to him one day, and they will receive infinitude of the injustice they inflicted on others, or the pain, rather. Have you come to the sources of the sea, or have you walked about in the recesses of the deep? Where does the sea begin? Where is its origin? Where does it all come? That's something no human can know. What caused it all, the first causational effect, that is something only known to God. And none of us can walk in the recesses of the deep because we'd have to swim there. This is not the reality on the level of air. The sea is a different thing, and we'd have to have gills. So we are ill-equipped to walk on the depth. And our lack of knowledge about the sea, that our knowledge of the space exceeds our knowledge of the sea, is just shows how little we really know of the sea. There are entire worlds, abysmal worlds, that we have not even discovered yet, that are waiting to be untapped. In our scientific age, the author of Job is, of course, writing from a pre-scientific era, but his astute observations show that he was a scientific observer, if not a scientist. Were the gates of death revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of the shadow of death? He is talking about hell there, the gates of death. This is where the dead cannot get out. They are imprisoned in solitude for all an eternity. So hell is a prison so there are gates in the prison, and you cannot get out of it. You cannot escape it. It is appointed unto man to die once. After that, the judgment. So there are plenty of second chances to repent in this life, but repent while you can. It's never too late. But why wait? Because you don't know the day of your death. None of us do. But the shadow of death, that is the terror and dread that just comes with the death. And death is a source of fear to the world that walks by sight, because as far as they know, there is no life after death. But we who walk by faith have the promise and the hope and the expectation of life after death. Have you understood the breadth of the earth? Declare if you know it all. The dimensions, now we have circumnavigated the globe. Magellan did that in the 1500s. Book of Job is written before the Exodus, sometime in the patriarchal period. So we're talking pre-1500 BC, or somewhere near that range. But, the world, the dimensions, no one could measure the Earth. We do know the mileage and dimensions of our planet by now, but this was beyond more primitive people's capacity to even ascertain that knowledge. As far as they knew, the end of the world was the Gibraltar to the west and China in the east. Where is the way of the dwelling of light? In darkness, where is its place? light and darknesses are forces. Now, darkness is not strictly speaking a force. Light is a force, but darkness is the absence of light. So light and darkness, they have definite points of origins, and where does it come from, and where does it, how does it shine, and where does it come from is answered in Genesis 1. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and that gave light to all the chaos of the darkness. So before that, there was darkness, then light became the force, and darkness is synonymous with Satan, sin, and death, and light is synonymous with God, good, and life. That you should take it to its boundary and know the path of its home. Everything in the universe has a home, a place where it belongs, and if it is, an animal who wanders into the wrong territory will be snatched, and because they departed from their home, they are no more. But there are boundaries within the animal kingdom, within the cosmological dimension of the earth and the space beyond it. So these things just expose our own ignorance, our own finite faculties, our own inability, and even unawareness of the things which lay beyond our capacity to know, and our inability to control these forces that we cannot even comprehend is a distressing dilemma for one who has a God complex. If you accept with humility that you are human and you have to live with ignorance and mystery, then you will know peace. But until that day, watch out. 21st and final verse of today. Yep. Do you know, for you would have been born then, and the number of your days been many. This is an eternal being speaking to a mortal, a finite, frail mortal who lived a long time ago and is no more. And outside of this book, we would have no reference of who he was. But the point is that, even Job was wise among men. He did not know. None of us were there. None of us can claim to know. And that is an act of presumption and blasphemy to even aspire to know these things. So he's using sarcasm that is somewhat identical to what Eliphaz, we read from him in 15:7. He says, you are mortal, you were born. How can you explain the one who is before the beginning and in the beginning and during the beginning, and the one in whom creation and time itself originates and emanates? He is God, we are not, and the trick to our happiness is accepting humbly our limitations as humans and not aspiring to be God. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.